The first time Mary Covington fired a shotgun at another human being, her hands did not shake, and that surprised her more than the blast itself. It was the spring of 1878, in the high grass country of the Wyoming Territory, where the wind never seemed to stop moving, and the mountains stood blue and far off like a promise nobody had kept yet. Mary was 22 years old, and she had buried her father only 11 days before, in the small cemetery behind the Covington homestead, beneath a cottonwood tree he had planted the year she was born. Her father, Silas Covington, had been a stubborn man, the kind who built a life out of raw prairie with nothing but a mule, a plow, and a will that would not bend even when the rest of him grew tired and gray. He had taught Mary to shoot before she was 10 years old, out of necessity rather than any wish to raise a gunslinger. Wolves took livestock. Rattlesnakes hid in the tall grass near the creek. And in those years, before the railroad barons and cattle kings carved up the territory like a Sunday roast, a person learned early that the land did not hand out mercy for free. What Elias had not managed to teach her, because he had not lived long enough, was how to face a man who believed he owned not just the land beneath her boots, but the very right for her to stand upon it. That man was named Silas Radford, and he called himself a cattle baron, though most folks in the town of Prairie Bend simply called him the Baron, spoken low and careful, the way one might speak of weather that could kill you. Radford had come from money back east, money made in shipping and then doubled and tripled in Chicago stockyards, and he had ridden west with the singular ambition of owning every acre between the Sweetwater River and the timber line. He had already swallowed up 6 homesteads in 2 years, some through purchase at prices so low they amounted to theft, others through means that never appeared in any court record, though the men who once worked those homesteads had simply vanished from the territory, their debts to the bank curiously paid in full by persons unknown. Silas Covington had refused to sell. He had refused for 3 years, through threats delivered politely by Radford's lawyer, through fences cut and cattle scattered, through a barn fire that took 2 horses and nearly took Mary's brother Thomas, who was 12 years old and slept in the loft. Elias refused until the night 4 of Radford's men rode onto Covington land in the dark and beat him so badly that he never fully woke from the injury, lingering 8 days with a fever that boiled his mind before his heart simply stopped. The sheriff in Prairie Bend, a heavy-set man named Otis Dunmore, who owed his badge and his salary to money that flowed, in circuitous ways, from Radford's cattle empire, ruled the death an accident. A fall from a horse, he said, though everyone who saw Silas Covington's body knew that no fall from any horse left a man's ribs staved in on both sides. So it was that, on a gray morning in April, 11 days after the funeral, Mary Covington stood on the porch of her father's house with her father's shotgun broken open across her arm, watching 6 riders come across the eastern pasture with Silas Radford's foreman at their head, a broad, sunburned man named Garrett Voss, who carried himself like he had never once in his life been told no, and meant to keep it that way. "Miss Covington," Voss called out, reining up 30 yards from the porch, though his men fanned out behind him in a way that made the distance feel smaller than it was. "Mr. Radford sent us to discuss the sale of this property." "There is no sale," Mary said. Her voice did not waver, though her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her throat. "My father made that plain to Mr. Radford more than once, and I am making it plain again. This land is not for sale, not now, not ever." "Your father is dead, Miss Covington." Voss said it flat, without even the courtesy of pretending sorrow. "And a young woman alone cannot hold a claim like this. It is not safe. It is not sensible. Mr. Radford is prepared to offer a fair price, more than fair, considering the circumstances." "The circumstances," Mary said, "being that your men murdered my father." A ripple went through the riders behind Voss, though none of them spoke. Voss's jaw tightened. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "One I would advise you not to repeat where it might reach the wrong ears." "I will repeat it to anyone who asks," Mary said, "and I will write it in a letter to the territorial governor if I must. Now get off my land." Voss's eyes traveled over her, over the shotgun still broken open, unloaded, resting harmless in the crook of her arm, and something in his face suggested he had already calculated that an unarmed woman posed no threat at all. He nudged his horse forward 2 steps. That was when Mary broke the shotgun closed with a snap that carried clear across the yard, raised it, and fired one barrel into the dirt not 6 feet from his horse's hooves. The animal reared, screaming, and Voss fought to keep his seat, while the other 5 riders scattered and swore. Mary broke the gun open again with hands that, to her own private astonishment, did not tremble at all, and reloaded the spent shell with one she had kept in her apron pocket since she first saw the dust of their approach rising on the eastern horizon. "The next one will not go into the dirt," she said. "Tell Mr. Radford that." Voss got his horse under control, glaring at her with a fury he did not bother to hide now. "You have made a mistake, girl," he said. "A grave one." "My father is already in his grave," Mary answered. "You will forgive me if I am not frightened of another." They rode off, and Mary stood on the porch until the dust of them had settled entirely, and only then did her knees go weak enough that she had to sit down hard on the top step, the shotgun across her lap, her brother Thomas coming out from where he had been hiding just inside the door, his face white as milk. "They will come back," Thomas said. He was 12, but grief and danger had aged him in the space of 2 weeks until he sometimes sounded like a man twice his years. "I know," Mary said. "What are we going to do?" Mary looked out at the land, the pasture rolling gold and green toward the tree line, the creek glinting silver where it cut through the low ground, the mountains standing patient and blue beyond it all. Her father had died for this ground. She would not simply hand it over to the man who killed him. "We are going to hold on," she said, "until I figure out how." It was 2 days later, on a road that ran along the northern edge of the Covington land, that Mary Covington first laid eyes on Noah Carson. She had ridden into Prairie Bend for supplies, flour and coffee and shells for the shotgun, since her supply of the latter had dwindled considerably after the confrontation with Voss, and she was riding back in the late afternoon when she came upon a man crouched beside a horse that had thrown a shoe on the rutted road, cursing softly under his breath in a way that suggested he was more frustrated than genuinely angry. He was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simply, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath the brim of a weathered hat. He wore the clothes of a drifting cowhand, a canvas coat gone soft with wear, boots that had been resoled more than once, and a gun belt that carried a single revolver, not for show but for the plain necessity of a man traveling alone through open country. "Trouble?" Mary asked, reining up a respectful distance away. The man looked up, and for a moment something passed over his face that she would only later understand was surprise at finding a woman traveling alone on that road, armed and unafraid, when so much of the territory buzzed with talk of a land baron's growing violence. "Thrown shoe," he said, standing and brushing dust from his knees. "I'm still a fair walk from town, and this animal is not going to appreciate the journey." "Prairie Bend has a smith," Mary said. "Old man Petrie on the north end of Main Street. He is honest, which is more than I can say for most men in that town these days." "I would be obliged for the direction," the man said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Noah Carson, Mary Covington." She watched something shift in his expression at her name, a flicker of recognition, and she felt her guard rise instinctively. "You have heard of me, then?" "I have heard of your father," Noah said, and there was something careful and respectful in the way he said it, nothing like the false sympathy of Sheriff Dunmore or the cold indifference of Garrett Voss. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Covington. I only arrived in this territory 2 weeks past, but even a stranger hears the talk in a town like Prairie Bend. Folks say Elias Covington was the last man standing against Silas Radford, and that he paid for it." Mary studied him, this stranger with the lame horse and the plain, honest face, and found she believed him. There was no calculation in his eyes, none of the practiced sympathy men used when they wanted something from her, whether it was her land or, in uglier moments since her father's death, other things men sometimes wanted from a young woman alone. He was the last man standing, Mary said, until 11 days ago. Now it is only my brother and myself. And you mean to keep standing, Noah said. It was not quite a question. I do. Something in his face settled then, a decision made, though she would not understand the shape of it until later. Then perhaps, he said, Prairie Bend has room for one more hand who is not afraid of hard work or of a fight, should it come to that. Mary felt a flare of suspicion. I do not know you, Mr. Carson. For all I know, you could be one of Radford's men, sent to worm your way onto my land under false pretenses. Noah's expression did not change, but something in his eyes went very still. Miss Covington, he said, I rode away from a ranch in the Nebraska Territory 2 years ago because the man who owned it treated his hands like they were cattle themselves, to be worked until they broke and then discarded without a second thought. I have seen what men like Radford do to the people beneath them. I want no part of building another man's empire on the backs of folks who never asked to be crushed by it. If you do not want my help, I understand it, and I will walk this horse to town and trouble you no further. But I offer it honestly, and I would be glad of the chance to prove it. There was a long silence between them, filled only by the wind moving through the grass and the distant call of a meadowlark. Mary studied his face for a long moment, and something in her, some instinct her father had trusted his whole life and taught her to trust as well, told her that this man was telling the truth. There is an old bunkhouse on my father's land, she said finally. It has not been used in some years, but the roof is sound. If you are willing to help me hold what is mine, Mr. Carson, I will feed you and give you a place to sleep, though I cannot promise much beyond that, not with things as they stand. That is more than fair, Noah said, and for the first time something like a smile touched his mouth. Now, if you would not mind waiting while I lead this poor animal to the smith, I would consider it a kindness. Mary found herself, despite everything, almost smiling back. I have nowhere else pressing to be, Mr. Carson. Noah, he said. If we are to work together, Miss Covington, I would consider it strange to be called by my surname every hour of the day. Then you may call me Mary, she said, though I warn you, I do not intend to make this an easy arrangement for either of us. There is a great deal of work and greater danger than work. I did not come west looking for ease, Noah said, and together, the woman on horseback and the man leading his lame horse, they made their way toward Prairie Bend beneath a sky going gold and orange at its edges. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were not without their own quiet, unexpected grace. Noah Carson proved himself, from the very first morning, to be exactly what he had claimed. A hard worker who understood cattle and horses and the thousand small tasks that kept a homestead alive, from mending fences to doctoring a sick calf to repairing the hinges on the barn door that had hung crooked since before Elias Covington's death. He rose before dawn and worked until dusk, and in the evenings he sat at the Covington table and ate whatever simple meal Mary had prepared. And he told stories, sometimes, of the places he had traveled before coming to the Wyoming Territory, of Texas cattle drives and Nebraska winters, and a mother back in Missouri who wrote him letters he carried, folded in his coat pocket, until the paper wore soft as cloth. Thomas took to him almost immediately, following him around the property with the eager devotion of a boy who had lost his father and found, in this quiet stranger, something like the shape of what he had lost. Noah taught him to whittle, taught him to read the weather in the color of the sky at evening, taught him the particular knot that held a saddle cinch fast even when a horse tried to swell its belly against the tightening. In the boy's laughter, in the way Thomas's shoulders had begun to straighten again instead of hunching under grief, Mary saw something in Noah Carson that told her more about his character than any words could have. But it was in smaller moments, moments she did not speak of even to herself for some time, that Mary began to understand the shape of what was growing between them. It was in the way Noah always seemed to know, without being told, when the weight of her father's absence pressed hardest on her, and would find some small task to draw her outside into the evening air, walking the fence line together in comfortable silence, or naming the stars as they emerged one by one over the darkening mountains. It was in the careful, deliberate way he asked after her father, drawing out stories of Elias Covington's life rather than only the manner of his death, so that Mary found herself laughing, sometimes, remembering her father's terrible singing voice or the time he had tried to teach himself to dance for her mother's birthday, and instead knocked over the entire supper table. It was in the evening 3 weeks after his arrival, when a spring storm rolled down from the mountains and the wind howled loud enough to worry the horses, and Noah had come in from securing the barn soaked through and shivering, and Mary had wrapped a blanket around his shoulders without quite thinking about what she was doing, her hands lingering a moment too long against the solid warmth of him, and their eyes had met in the lamplight, and something passed between them that neither one of them named aloud, though both of them felt it settle into their chests like a stone dropped into still water. "Mary," Noah said quietly, and it was the first time he had said her name in a voice that carried something beyond simple friendliness, something rougher and more careful all at once. "Do not," Mary said, though she did not step back. "Do not say something neither of us can take back, not now, not with everything as it is." "I only meant to say," Noah said, and his voice was low, careful, "that I have not felt this steady in a long while, not since before I left Missouri. I do not know what that means exactly, or what right I have to feel it, given the circumstances of your father and the danger still hanging over this land. But I did not want to pretend I did not feel it." Mary looked up at him, at the rain-damp hair curling against his forehead, at the honest steadiness in his eyes that had drawn her trust from that very first meeting on the road, and she felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the night her father died. "I feel it too," she admitted softly, as though speaking it too loudly might frighten it away. "But I cannot let myself think of it, Noah, not fully, not while Radford's shadow hangs over everything. I will not bring a man I care for into that kind of danger only to lose him the way I lost my father." "Then we will face the danger together," Noah said, "and worry about the rest of it after. I did not come to this land to run from hard things, Mary. I came because I was tired of watching men like Radford win simply because good people were too frightened to stand against them. I am not leaving now." Outside, the storm rattled the windows and the wind screamed through the eaves, but inside the little farmhouse kitchen, something warmer had begun to grow, fragile as a new seedling, but tenacious as the prairie grass that survived drought and fire and the endless grinding wind, always finding a way to grow back green. It was not 2 weeks later that Silas Radford himself came to call. He arrived not with his army of riders, but alone, save for his driver, in a fine black carriage that looked entirely out of place on the rutted road leading to the Covington homestead. He was a tall man, silver-haired despite being no more than 50, dressed in a manner that spoke of Eastern tailors and expensive habits, and he carried himself with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the world would eventually arrange itself according to his wishes. Mary met him on the porch, Noah at her side and Thomas hovering in the doorway behind them, and she felt her father's shotgun leaning within easy reach against the porch rail, though she did not touch it, not yet. "Miss Covington," Radford said, removing his hat with a courtliness that made Mary's skin crawl, given everything she knew of him. "I confess I had hoped we might speak as civilized people, rather than continuing this unfortunate business of armed confrontations." "There would be no armed confrontations, Mr. Radford," Mary said, "if your men had not murdered my father and then ridden onto my land to threaten me." Something flickered across Radford's face, gone almost before it appeared. "A tragic accident," he said smoothly. "I have expressed my condolences through my associate, Mr. Voss, and I express them again now. Your father was a stubborn man, Miss Covington, but I respected his tenacity, even as I found it inconvenient to my own ambitions. Say what you came to say, Noah said, his voice even but carrying an edge that had not been there before. Radford's eyes flicked to him with mild curiosity. And you would be, Noah Carson, I work this land now. Ah, Radford's smile did not reach his eyes. A hired hand playing protector to the grieving daughter. How romantic. He turned back to Mary before Noah could respond to the barb. I will be direct, Miss Covington, as directness seems to be valued in this household. I am prepared to offer you $8,000 for this property, a sum considerably more generous than the land's actual value, in recognition of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding your father's death. This offer will not remain open indefinitely. This land is not for sale, Mr. Radford. It was not for sale when you made the same offer to my father, and it is not for sale now. Radford's expression cooled by several degrees. You are young, Miss Covington, and I understand that grief clouds judgment. But you must understand the position you occupy. I control the water rights along the Sweetwater for 30 miles in either direction. I control the price the railroad pays for cattle shipped from this territory. I control, through various arrangements, the disposition of law enforcement in Prairie Bend and 3 surrounding counties. A single homestead, however stubbornly held, cannot stand against the tide of progress I represent. My father stood against it for 3 years, Mary said, and he died standing, rather than kneeling to a man who murders his neighbors to steal their land. I intend to do the same, Mr. Radford, though I would prefer to live a long life doing it rather than follow him to that cemetery any time soon. Radford studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze shifted from condescension toward something colder and more calculating. You are a fool, Miss Covington, but I admire tenacity even when it is misguided. I will give you 1 month to reconsider. After that, I fear circumstances may become considerably less pleasant for you and your young brother. Is that a threat, Mr. Radford? Noah asked, his voice deadly quiet now. It is a fact of the world we live in, Mr. Carson, Radford said, replacing his hat. The territory is changing. Men like myself are building something lasting here, something that will outlast us all. Small holdings like this one are simply obstacles in the path of that progress, and obstacles, in my experience, are eventually removed, one way or another. He gave a slight, formal bow toward Mary. Good day, Miss Covington. I hope for your sake that you reconsider before the month is out. He returned to his carriage and was driven away, and Mary stood on the porch watching the dust settle, her heart pounding with a mixture of fury and fear that she did not fully let herself feel until Noah's hand found hers, steady and warm, and she allowed herself, for just a moment, to lean into the solid comfort of him. 1 month, she said quietly. Then we have 1 month to prepare, Noah said, and we will not spend it idle. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation that left little room for anything else, though the current running beneath the surface between Mary and Noah continued to deepen with every shared task, every stolen glance across the supper table, every moment when their hands brushed while working side by side, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as propriety might have demanded. Noah, it turned out, had connections in the territory that Mary had not expected. Word of Radford's growing tyranny had spread far beyond Prairie Bend, and there were other homesteaders, smaller ranchers, even a few merchants in town who resented the way Radford's influence had strangled fair competition, who were willing, quietly, to offer what help they could. A neighboring rancher named Hiram Dell, whose land bordered the Covington property to the south, sent over 2 of his own hands to help reinforce the barn and the fence lines, along with a case of shells for the shotgun and a rifle that had belonged to his own late father. The blacksmith Petrie, who had shod Noah's horse that first day, proved to be quietly furious at Radford's manipulation of the town, and he offered to repair and strengthen the iron hardware on the house's windows and doors without charge, working late into the evenings after his regular shop hours. Even Sheriff Dunmore, corrupt as he was, seemed uneasy about the prospect of open violence against a young woman whose father's death had already stirred uncomfortable talk in the territory. He would not act against Radford, not directly, but he let it be known, through a careful word to Noah in the general store, that he would be slow to respond to any calls from the Covington property, whatever that might mean. But preparation alone would not be enough, and both Mary and Noah knew it. Radford commanded, by Noah's careful count during a scouting ride along the northern boundary of Radford's own vast ranch, no fewer than 20 armed riders in his direct employ, men hired not for their skill with cattle, but for their willingness to use a gun when ordered. Against that, Mary had her shotgun, Noah's revolver and the rifle from Hiram Dell, and whatever help her small circle of allies could provide, most of whom had families and lands of their own that could not be entirely abandoned even in solidarity. "We cannot win a fight of numbers," Noah said one evening, as they sat together on the porch steps watching the sun sink behind the mountains, close enough that their shoulders touched, though neither commented on it. "If Radford brings his full force against this place, we will be overwhelmed, whatever help Dell and the others can offer." "Then what do we do?" Mary asked. "I will not simply hand this land over to him, Noah. I would rather die defending it than live having surrendered it." "I know," Noah said quietly, "and I would not ask you to surrender, not after everything your father sacrificed to hold this ground, but there may be another way." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Radford's power in this territory depends on more than his riders, Mary. It depends on the law looking the other way, on the railroad and the bank cooperating with his ambitions, on nobody in the territorial government asking too many questions about how a man builds an empire so quickly through such convenient accidents and unfortunate incidents. If we could bring that kind of attention to bear, force someone with actual authority to look closely at what has happened here, at what happened to your father, it might do more to stop him than any number of guns." "The territorial governor," Mary said slowly, understanding dawning. "Or a federal marshal," Noah said. "Someone beyond Radford's reach, beyond his bribes and his intimidation. I have heard talk in town of a marshal named Coburn who has been investigating land fraud complaints across the territory, a man with a reputation for being incorruptible. If we could get word to him, present evidence of what Radford has done here and elsewhere. It would take weeks for a letter to reach him and for him to respond if he responded at all," Mary said. "Radford gave us 1 month. Then someone will have to ride to find him directly," Noah said. "I have heard he keeps a circuit through the southern part of the territory near Fort Laramie. It is a hard ride, 4 days each way if the weather holds, but if I leave within the week—" "No," Mary said immediately, and the force of her own reaction surprised her. "No, Noah, I will not have you ride off alone into territory crawling with Radford's men, not when the month grows shorter with every day you are gone. What if he attacks while you are away? What if something happens to you on the road?" "Mary," Noah turned to face her fully, his expression gentle but resolute. "I understand your fear, but if we do nothing beyond simply preparing to fight a battle we cannot win, we will lose everything regardless, whether I ride for help or not. This is the better chance, even if it is not without risk." Mary looked at him for a long moment, feeling the truth of his words war against every instinct that screamed at her not to let him ride away from her, not after everything, not after finally allowing herself to hope for something beyond mere survival. "If you go," she said finally, quietly, "you will come back to me. Do you understand? Whatever happens, whatever you find on that road, you will come back." Something in Noah's face softened at the raw honesty in her voice, the admission it carried of feelings neither of them had fully spoken aloud. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gently over her knuckles. "Mary Covington," he said, "I have ridden away from a great many things in my life. Ranches that treated men poorly, towns that offered nothing but the same hard grind day after day. Even, if I am honest, the fear of ever letting myself care about someone enough that losing them might break me. But I am not riding away from you. I am riding toward the only chance I can see of us having a future together on this land, free of Radford's shadow. I will come back, Mary. I swear it on my own father's memory." Mary felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and fierce, and before she quite knew what she was doing, she had leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, soft and brief, but carrying within it every fear and every hope she had not allowed herself to voice in the weeks since her father's death. Noah's hand came up to cup her face gently, and for a long moment the danger and the deadline and the whole weight of Radford's threat seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them together, beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars. "Come back to me," Mary whispered again when they finally parted. "Always," Noah said. Noah left 3 days later before dawn, riding Hiram Dell's fastest horse, carrying with him a written account Mary had prepared of everything that had happened to her family, along with statements gathered quietly from 2 other homesteaders who had lost land to Radford's schemes and were willing, at last, to speak the truth to someone with the power to act on it. The days that followed were the longest Mary had ever known. She threw herself into work, into strengthening the house, into teaching Thomas how to load and fire the rifle should the worst come to pass, into long nights sitting up with the shotgun across her knees, listening to every sound the wind carried across the darkened prairie, imagining each one to be the approach of Radford's riders. Word came, on the 6th day, that Radford had grown impatient. Garrett Voss rode onto Covington land once more, this time with 8 men at his back rather than 6, and delivered a message that chilled Mary to her core. "Mr. Radford's patience has grown thin, Miss Covington," Voss said, his eyes flicking with something like satisfaction toward the empty bunkhouse, clearly noting Noah's absence. "He has learned that your protector has ridden south, no doubt seeking help that will not arrive in time to matter. Mr. Radford wishes me to inform you that his offer now stands reduced to $6,000, and that you have exactly 1 week remaining before he considers the matter resolved through other means. Tell Mr. Radford," Mary said, standing firm on her porch with the shotgun held ready, though her heart hammered with fear for what Voss's words might mean for Noah, "that my answer remains the same, and will remain the same regardless of how many times he sends you to threaten me." Voss's smile was cruel and knowing. "A brave woman, Miss Covington. A foolish one, but brave. I wonder how brave you will feel when we return in force, and there is no drifter with a borrowed gun to hide behind." They rode away, and Mary stood trembling on the porch, not from fear for herself, but from a fear that clawed at her chest like a living thing. Fear that Voss's words held some terrible truth, that Radford's men had somehow intercepted Noah on the road south, that she might lose him the same way she had lost her father, to the casual, brutal violence of men who valued nothing beyond their own power and profit. That night, she could not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a single candle burning low, her father's Bible open before her though she read none of its words, simply needing something solid to hold on to while her mind conjured every terrible possibility that might have befallen the man she loved. It was Thomas who found her there near midnight, his young face drawn with worry that no boy of 12 should have to carry. "He will come back, Mary," Thomas said, settling into the chair beside her with the quiet solemnity that grief had taught him young. "Noah is not like the men who work for Radford. He would not break a promise to you." "I know," Mary whispered, though her voice cracked on the words. "I know, Thomas. I am only frightened." "Papa was frightened too, sometimes," Thomas said. "He told me once before everything. He said being frightened did not mean a person was weak. He said the bravest thing a person could do was keep standing even while they were frightened, because that was what real courage looked like, not being unafraid but standing anyway." Mary looked at her young brother, at the wisdom their father's memory had somehow instilled in him even in the wreckage of grief, and she felt something in her chest steady, just slightly. "Your father was a wise man," she said, pulling Thomas into a fierce hug. I am glad you remember him so well. I am glad you are my sister, Thomas said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. I do not think I could stand any of this without you. We will stand together, Mary said. Whatever comes. Noah Carson found the marshal on the fourth day of his ride, at a small outpost near Fort Laramie, where a circuit of federal authority intersected with the sprawling, half-lawless expanse of the territory. Marshal Amos Coburn was a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 50, with a face weathered by decades of frontier justice and eyes that had seen enough corruption and cruelty to make him slow to trust, but quick to recognize the truth when it was finally placed before him. Noah spent 2 full days providing testimony, presenting Mary's written account along with the statements from the other homesteaders, answering every hard question the marshal put to him about dates and details, and the exact nature of the violence that had been visited upon the Covington family and others in the territory. Coburn listened with the careful, methodical attention of a man building a case rather than simply reacting to a story, and by the end of the second day, he had reached a decision. I have suspected something of this nature regarding Radford for some months, Coburn said, as they sat together in the small office that served as his temporary headquarters. Complaints have reached my desk before, though none with the detail and corroboration you have brought me, Mr. Carson. This is enough to warrant a full investigation, and enough, I believe, to justify federal intervention if Radford's men make any move toward further violence. There is little time, Marshal, Noah said. Radford gave Miss Covington 1 month to sell, and more than a week of that has already passed while I made this ride. If we do not return with sufficient force to check his ambitions, I fear what he may do. Coburn studied him for a long moment. You care for this young woman, Mr. Carson. I can hear it in your voice. Noah did not deny it. I do, Marshal. More than I have ever cared for anyone in my life, and I will not let Silas Radford take from her what he has already taken from her father. Something like approval flickered across Coburn's weathered face. Then we ride at first light, he said, with as many deputized men as I can gather on short notice. It will not be an army to match Radford's numbers directly, but it will carry the weight of federal authority, and that, Mr. Carson, is worth more than numbers alone when it comes to men like Radford, who have built their power on the law looking away. When the law looks directly at them instead, their confidence tends to falter considerably. They rode out from the outpost the following morning, Marshal Coburn and 6 deputized men alongside Noah, pushing their horses hard across the long miles of prairie that separated them from Prairie Bend, and from the woman Noah had promised, with every fiber of his being, that he would return to safely. But word of movements in the territory traveled fast, carried by riders and telegraph lines, and the loose network of information that connected even the most remote corners of frontier life. And Silas Radford learned, through his own connections, that a federal marshal was riding north with evidence gathered against him. Rather than wait for that reckoning to arrive, rather than risk the scrutiny that federal investigation would bring to bear on his empire, Radford made the calculation that many tyrants before him had made, that a swift, decisive strike against the source of his troubles might resolve the matter before outside authority could intervene. He gathered his full force, 18 riders in all, and set out for the Covington homestead on the very day that Noah and the marshal's party were still 2 full days' ride away, believing, with the arrogant confidence of a man who had never truly been opposed, that he could eliminate the problem entirely before help arrived. Mary Covington saw the dust of their approach from a distance that gave her perhaps 20 minutes to prepare, and in that 20 minutes, with her heart hammering and her hands trembling despite every effort at composure, she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that this was the moment her father's death had been building toward all along. She sent Thomas to the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, over his fierce protests that he wanted to stand and fight alongside her. "You are 12 years old," Mary said, gripping his shoulders hard enough to still his struggling. "I have already lost our father, Thomas. I will not lose you as well. If something happens to me, you must survive. Do you understand? You must survive and tell people the truth of what happened here. Mary, please, promise me, Thomas." Her voice cracked with the effort of holding back tears she could not afford to shed now, not with the enemy approaching. "Promise me you will stay hidden, whatever you hear, whatever happens." Thomas's young face crumpled, but he nodded, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. "I promise," he whispered. Mary embraced him fiercely, then helped him into the root cellar, sealing the trapdoor above him and dragging a heavy rug across it to disguise its location as best she could. Then she took up her father's shotgun, checked that both barrels were loaded, filled her apron pockets with every remaining shell she possessed, and walked out onto the porch to face what was coming. Hiram Dell's two hands, who had been helping with repairs that week, stood with her, along with old Petrie the blacksmith, who had arrived that very morning to deliver reinforced hinges for the barn door and had refused, despite Mary's protests, to leave once he understood what was approaching. It was not much of a force against 18 riders, 4 people including Mary herself, but it was more than she would have faced alone. Silas Radford himself rode at the head of the approaching column, flanked by Garrett Voss, and as they drew rein at the edge of the yard, Mary could see in Radford's face an expression she had not seen there before, not the cold, patient confidence of their previous meetings, but something more urgent, almost frantic beneath its careful control. "Miss Covington," Radford called out, "I fear this matter must be concluded today. Circumstances have arisen that require rather more haste than I would have preferred." "You mean the marshal riding to expose you?" Mary called back, standing her ground on the porch though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Yes, I know about that, Mr. Radford. It seems your empire may not outlast you after all." Something flickered across Radford's face, quickly suppressed. "You know nothing," he snapped, his composure fraying at the edges. "Whatever evidence your drifter has gathered will mean nothing once this property changes hands and the troublesome witness who might have testified against me is no longer available to do so." The threat, spoken so plainly, sent ice through Mary's veins, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "You would murder me in broad daylight, in front of 18 witnesses, Mr. Radford. Even you cannot believe that would remain hidden." "My men are loyal," Radford said, though something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "And accidents, as we have discussed before, Miss Covington, do happen with some regularity in this territory." He gestured, and Voss and several of the riders began to advance across the yard. Mary raised the shotgun, her hands steady despite the terror pounding through her chest, and beside her, Petrie and Dell's two hands raised their own weapons, a rifle and 2 aging pistols that seemed pitifully inadequate against the force arrayed before them. "I will not go easily," Mary called out, her voice carrying clear across the yard, carrying in it not just her own defiance but the accumulated weight of every injustice Radford had inflicted upon this land and its people. "My father did not go easily, and I am his daughter. If you want this land, Mr. Radford, you will have to take it over my dead body, and I promise you, I will make certain at least some of your men join me in that grave." For a moment, the whole scene held frozen, the afternoon sun beating down on the standoff, the wind carrying the scent of prairie grass and gathering violence in equal measure. Then Radford's face hardened into something cold and final. "Take her," he said. "Kill anyone who resists." The riders surged forward and Mary fired, the shotgun's roar tearing through the tense air, catching the lead rider's horse in the flank and sending both animal and man crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and screaming. She broke the gun open, reloading with hands that moved on pure instinct and desperate necessity, while beside her, Petrie's rifle cracked and one of Dell's hands fired his pistol, the small defensive force fighting with the ferocity of people who knew they had nothing left to lose. It was chaos, gunfire and shouting and horses screaming, and Mary felt time slow to a strange, terrible crawl as she fired her second barrel, catching another rider in the shoulder and watching him tumble from his saddle. She broke the gun open again, but her shells were running low, and Voss himself was bearing down on her now, his own pistol raised, his face twisted with the particular fury of a man who had never expected genuine resistance and found himself humiliated by it. "You should have sold when you had the chance," Voss snarled, leveling his weapon at her. That was the moment Mary Covington truly believed she was going to die, standing on her father's porch with an empty shotgun and no time left to reload, watching a man's finger tighten on a trigger that would end everything she had fought to preserve. The shot that rang out did not come from Voss's gun. It came from the tree line at the northern edge of the property, where Noah Carson, having ridden through the night without rest upon learning from a passing rider that Radford's full force had descended on the Covington homestead, arrived not a moment too soon, Marshal Coburn and his 6 deputized men, thundering across the pasture behind him like an answer to every prayer Mary had not dared voice aloud. Noah's shot caught Voss's gun arm, sending the pistol spinning from his grip before he could fire, and in the same instant, Marshal Coburn's voice boomed across the yard with the full weight of federal authority behind it. "United States Marshal, lay down your weapons, all of you, in the name of federal law." The effect on Radford's remaining riders was immediate and telling. Men who had been willing to threaten and even kill an unarmed young woman under the protection of their employer's private power found their courage evaporating rapidly at the prospect of federal charges and the noose that accompanied conviction for murder under such circumstances. Weapons began to lower, then drop entirely to the dust, as rider after rider recognized that the balance of the confrontation had shifted decisively. Radford himself sat frozen on his horse, his face draining of color as he watched his empire's foundation crumble in real time. "This is not lawful," he sputtered, as Coburn's men moved to secure the scene. "You have no authority here, Marshal. This is a private property dispute. This is a federal investigation into land fraud, extortion, and the murder of Elias Covington," Coburn said, his voice hard as granite as he dismounted and approached Radford directly. "I have testimony and evidence sufficient to see you tried for these crimes, Mr. Radford, and what I have witnessed here today, an armed assault against an unarmed woman on her own legally held property, will serve as rather compelling additional evidence for any jury. Garrett Voss, and any of you men who wish to avoid hanging alongside your employer, I would suggest you begin talking, and talking honestly, about exactly what happened on the night Elias Covington died." The confrontation that followed unfolded with the strange, deflating anticlimax that often follows moments of extreme tension, as Radford's carefully constructed empire began to unravel not through further violence, but through the mundane machinery of arrest and interrogation. Several of the riders, faced with the prospect of hanging for a murder they had merely witnessed rather than committed, began speaking rapidly, offering testimony against both Voss and Radford in exchange for leniency, confirming what Mary had known all along: that Radford had ordered the beating that killed her father, intending only to intimidate him into selling, never expecting the violence to prove fatal, and that Sheriff Dunmore had been paid handsomely to rule the death accidental rather than investigate further. Through all of this, Mary stood frozen on the porch, the empty shotgun still clutched in her hands, watching the man who had murdered her father finally face the reckoning that justice demanded, while Noah dismounted and crossed the yard toward her at a run, his face etched with fear and relief in equal measure. "Mary." He reached her in moments, his hands coming up to cup her face, checking her for injury with an urgency that spoke louder than any words could have. "Are you hurt? Mary, look at me, are you hurt?" "I am unhurt," Mary managed, though her voice shook badly now that the immediate danger had passed, the accumulated terror of the past minutes finally breaking through the composure that had held her together. "Thomas, I need to get Thomas. He is hidden in the cellar. I will get him," Noah said. But Mary was already moving, and together they hurried into the house, pulling back the rug and throwing open the trapdoor to find Thomas huddled in the darkness below, tears streaming down his face but otherwise unharmed. "Mary!" Thomas scrambled up into her arms the moment she reached down for him, sobbing with the relief of a child who had listened to gunfire and shouting for what must have felt like an eternity, uncertain if his sister still lived. "I heard the shooting. I was so frightened, I thought, I am here," Mary said, holding him close, her own tears finally falling freely now. "I am here, Thomas. We are safe. Noah came back. He kept his promise." Outside, the yard had transformed from a battlefield into a scene of arrests and organization, as Marshal Coburn's deputies secured Radford, Voss, and the remaining riders who had not fled during the chaos, binding their hands and preparing to transport them to face federal charges. Petrie and Dell's two hands, though shaken and one of them nursing a minor wound to his arm, had survived the confrontation, and the relief among the small group of defenders was palpable as the full scope of their victory became clear. Silas Radford, as he was led toward a wagon that would transport him to face trial, made one final attempt at his old arrogance. "You have won nothing, Miss Covington," he called out. "There will be other men like me, other empires built on this land. You cannot stop the tide of progress with a shotgun and stubbornness." Mary, standing on her porch with Thomas held close and Noah's arm coming to rest steady and warm around her shoulders, met his gaze without flinching. "Perhaps you are right, Mr. Radford," she said. "Perhaps there will be other men who try what you tried. But my father taught me that the land does not belong to whoever has the most guns or the most money. It belongs to whoever loves it enough to stand and fight for it, honestly, without murder and theft dressed up as progress. You never understood that. I hope, wherever you spend the rest of your days, you have time to consider it." Radford said nothing more, and the wagon carried him away toward Prairie Bend, toward a trial that would, in the months that followed, see him convicted of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder, stripped of his vast landholdings, which would be redistributed among the very homesteaders he had tried to crush, and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, a sentence that effectively ended his reign of terror over the Sweetwater Valley forever. Garrett Voss, whose testimony against Radford proved crucial in securing the conviction, received a reduced sentence of 8 years for his role in the violence, while Sheriff Dunmore was removed from office in disgrace and faced his own charges of corruption and obstruction of justice. But all of that lay in the future, unfolding over the weeks and months that followed. In the immediate aftermath of that terrible, triumphant day, what mattered to Mary Covington was simpler and more immediate. The solid warmth of Noah Carson's arm around her shoulders, the small weight of her brother held safe in her embrace, and the golden afternoon light settling peacefully over land that, for the first time since her father's death, felt entirely and finally her own. "You came back," Mary said, turning to look up at Noah, her eyes still bright with tears but her voice steadier now. "I told you I would," Noah said softly. "I rode through the night, Mary. I do not think I have ever been so frightened in my life as I was on that ride, not knowing if I would arrive in time." "You arrived exactly in time," Mary said. "You saved my life, Noah. You saved all of us." "We saved each other," Noah said. "You held them off long enough for help to arrive, Mary. That took more courage than I have seen in most men twice your age and experience. Your father would have been proud beyond words." Mary felt fresh tears rise at the mention of her father, but they were different tears now, not the sharp grief of loss but something softer, a bittersweet gratitude that he had lived long enough to raise a daughter capable of finishing what he had started. "I wish he could have seen this," she said quietly. "Seen justice finally done." "Perhaps he did," Noah said, glancing toward the cottonwood tree where Elias Covington rested. "Perhaps he has been watching this whole while, prouder than he ever managed to say while he lived." That evening, After the marshal and his deputies had departed with their prisoners, after Petrie and Dell's hands had ridden home to their own families with the news of Radford's downfall spreading like wildfire across the territory, Mary and Noah sat together on the porch steps as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple over the mountains, Thomas already asleep inside, exhausted by the day's terrible and wonderful events. "What happens now?" Mary asked quietly, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Now," Noah said, "I suppose we continue exactly as we have been, if that is agreeable to you, working this land, raising your brother, building something together that no man like Radford will ever again threaten to take away." "That is agreeable," Mary said, leaning her head against his shoulder, feeling for the first time in weeks a peace that ran deeper than mere relief at surviving the day's violence. "Though I confess, Noah, I find myself hoping we might build something more than simply working the land together." Noah turned to look at her, and in the fading light, she could see the depth of feeling in his eyes, feeling that had been growing steadily since that first meeting on the road weeks before, tempered and proven through danger, and now finally free to bloom fully. "Mary Covington," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have loved you, I think, since that very first afternoon, watching you face down Radford's men with nothing but your father's shotgun and more courage than I had ever witnessed in another person. I did not let myself name it fully, not with the danger hanging over us, but I cannot pretend any longer that what I feel for you is anything less than love, the kind of love that does not fade with time or hardship, but grows stronger for having weathered both." "I love you too," Mary said, her voice breaking with the simple, overwhelming truth of it. "I have for weeks now, though I was too frightened to speak it aloud, frightened of losing you the way I lost my father. But you came back to me, Noah. You kept your promise, and I do not think I could bear to spend another day without telling you how completely I love you." Noah drew her close then, and their kiss beneath the darkening sky held none of the desperate uncertainty of their first, but instead a settled, joyful certainty, a promise made complete now that the danger had passed, and only the future remained before them, wide open as the prairie itself. They were married that autumn, in a small ceremony held in the yard of the Covington homestead, beneath the same cottonwood tree where Elias Covington rested, with Thomas standing proud beside his sister as she walked the short distance to where Noah waited, and with Hiram Dell, Petrie, and half of Prairie Bend in attendance, the whole community having come to understand, through the events of that terrible and triumphant spring, exactly what kind of courage and love had taken root on that stretch of prairie ground. The years that followed brought their own share of hardship, as frontier life always did. Harsh winters that tested every ounce of resilience, seasons of drought that threatened crops and cattle alike, the ordinary griefs and joys of building a life together in a land that demanded everything a person had to give. But they faced each hardship together, Mary and Noah Carson, as partners in every sense of the word, building the Covington homestead into a thriving ranch that grew, over the years, to encompass not just the original acreage but additional land purchased fairly and honestly as their success allowed. Thomas grew into a fine young man under their combined guidance, eventually taking on much of the day-to-day management of the ranch's cattle operations as he came into his own manhood, though he never forgot the lessons of courage and integrity that his father had first instilled, and that his sister and brother-in-law had continued to model throughout his youth. At 19, he married a young woman from a neighboring homestead, the daughter of one of the very families who had lost land to Radford's schemes years before, and their union felt, to all who witnessed it, like a fitting continuation of the healing that had begun on that terrible, transformative day when justice finally arrived on the Sweetwater Valley. Mary and Noah welcomed their first child 2 years after their marriage, a son they named Elias, after the grandfather he would never meet but whose legacy of stubborn integrity would shape the family for generations to come. 3 years later came a daughter, whom they named Sarah, after Noah's own mother back in Missouri, who traveled west by train once the railroad finally extended its reach into the territory, to meet her grandchildren and see for herself the life her son had built with the remarkable young woman he had written about so fondly in his letters home. The old bunkhouse where Noah had first slept upon arriving at the Covington homestead was eventually converted into additional living quarters as the family grew, though Mary insisted on preserving one small corner of it exactly as it had been, a quiet reminder of the humble beginning from which their life together had grown. In the farmhouse itself, in a place of honor above the fireplace mantel, hung Elias Covington's shotgun, no longer needed for its original desperate purpose, but kept always as a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that had secured the land for the generations that followed. On summer evenings, as their children grew and multiplied, first Elias, then Sarah, and eventually two more sons, Noah and Mary would often sit together on that same porch where they had first spoken of love beneath a rain-darkened sky, watching their children play in the golden fields their father and grandfather had fought so hard to preserve. And they would remember with gratitude rather than sorrow now the terrible spring of 1878 when everything had nearly been lost, and everything, through courage and love and the timely arrival of justice, had instead been saved. Silas Radford served 11 years of his 20-year sentence before dying in the territorial prison of a fever that swept through the facility one particularly harsh winter, his once vast empire scattered among the very homesteaders he had tried to crush, his name remembered in the valley thereafter as a cautionary tale of the corruption that unchecked power could breed, and as a testament to the courage of ordinary people who refused to bow before it. Prairie Bend itself grew and prospered in the years that followed, its economy no longer strangled by a single man's monopolistic ambitions, but instead flourishing through the fair competition and community cooperation that Radford's downfall had made possible. A new sheriff, elected honestly by the town's citizens after Dunmore's disgraceful removal, kept the peace with integrity that stood in stark contrast to his predecessor's corruption, and the town itself became known throughout the territory as a place where justice, however delayed, eventually prevailed. Marshal Amos Coburn continued his work investigating land fraud and corruption throughout the Wyoming Territory for many years afterward, and he remained a welcome guest at the Carson Ranch whenever his duties brought him through the Sweetwater Valley, often regaling Mary and Noah's growing children with stories of frontier justice that left them wide-eyed with wonder, never quite believing that their own quiet, loving parents had once stood at the center of such dramatic events. Until Thomas, grown into a respected rancher in his own right, would confirm every detail with the solemn authority of someone who had lived through it himself, hidden in a root cellar while his sister faced down an army with nothing but her father's shotgun and her own unshakable nerve. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the children were finally settled into sleep, Mary Covington Carson would sometimes walk out to the cottonwood tree where her father rested, Noah's hand steady in her own, and she would speak softly to the memory of the man who had taught her to shoot, to work, to love this stubborn, beautiful land with everything she had. "We held on, Papa," she would say. "Just like you taught me. We held on and we built something good, something that will last." The wind would move through the grass in answer, carrying with it the particular piece of land finally, truly at rest, home to a family that had fought for it, bled for it, and loved it enough to make it flourish for generations yet to come. And in that peace, Mary Covington Carson found the fullest measure of what her father's sacrifice and her own courage had purchased. Not simply survival, but a life rich with love, laughter, and the deep, abiding satisfaction of a promise kept, a homestead preserved, and a heart that had found, against all the dangers of that terrible spring, exactly where it belonged,